And this is week 83 of the weekly discussions, and we're asking, how about when God works through ineffective people to do extraordinary things in this world? What is effective altruism? Effective altruism is two things, really. It's an idea and it's a community focused on using evidence and careful reasoning to figure out the very best ways to improve the world and then to act on that basis. So I'm talking to you from the Christian Effective Altruism group. We're a group of Christians within this global movement. So real quick, what are the kinds of people who are in EA? Just to do some broad stereotyping, which may or may not be helpful. Some have the impression that the effective altruism movement is very young, it's very ambitious. There's a lot about education. In fact, a lot of EA communities and groups are at universities. And a lot of these universities are also top universities or Ivy League schools among them. So just to give a sense of makeup, these stereotypes seem to be pretty true in some sense. The average age within the effective altruism movement, according to the survey back in 2019 from Rethink Priorities, is about 31. And it tails off quite rapidly after the 30s. So broadly speaking, EA is quite young. EA is also quite highly educated. The average EA has, I think over 90% has at least a post-secondary degree or is working to attain one. And many, almost half, have either a master's or a doctoral degree as well. And if you look at the universities that people in the EA have attended, it's quite shocking how many have been to either an Oxford, Cambridge University or a top 10 school in the US. So all this kind of leads to this maybe unhelpful, but somewhat true stereotype of EAs being quite elite, some might even say. But when you contrast that with the quote unquote ordinary person on Earth, you get a different picture. The National Geographic conducted this survey where they took the attributes of basically everybody on Earth using various different data banks, and they tried to find what the quote unquote median person would look like based off of these attributes. Or in other words, if you were to draw a random person out of a hat who's living on Earth, what would they look like? And according to their survey, you'd find someone who's like a 28-year-old Han Chinese man, someone who's Christian, has no car, makes around $12,000 a year working in the service industry, has a mobile phone, and has no bank account. A fun fact, Ethan Edwards, who's someone in our community, he recreated this app, and I think he's done it for various different countries and with many more dimensions. So he presented that at an EA for Christians retreat last year. It was really interesting. You can talk to him if you're interested in that kind of thing. But this idea that EA is an elite community, which may in some ways be true, and also this tendency within some EA organizations to speak very highly and to hire from really exceptional talent, paints this image that EA is looking for highly effective people. But when we look at scripture, we see lots of examples where God works through people we wouldn't call highly effective, people who we would think of as normal, people who we would think of as ordinary. And God calls these people and does extraordinary good through their lives and ministry. I want to look at a couple of these people, and then maybe we can explore together to ask what this tension amounts to between what we see in scripture and what we see in the EA movement, if anything at all. The first person I think of when I think of ordinary people in scripture who God uses for tremendous good is David. So before David was king and the most famous king in the Old Testament, he was a shepherd boy. He was quite small, and shepherds at the time, of course, were not. This was not a renowned profession. People didn't grow up wanting to be shepherds if they could, if they could choose their career path. And most people back in the day could not just choose their career path. They do now. And yet David was chosen to be the warrior who would face Goliath to represent Israel and to redeem Israel from the Philistines. Also, another arguably ordinary person is the person of Esther, who we read goes before the king and wins basically a beauty contest, and through a long chain of events redeems her people. And no one would have ever seen that coming from where Esther began. Yet we see God working between the lines in her story. Another group of ordinary people that we see in Scripture are the disciples. Don't mind my image here from the series The Chosen, pretty good series. If you haven't seen it, I do recommend. The disciples were a pretty ragtag group, and not many of them came from high positions, but they came to follow Jesus, who himself was not in a particularly high position, and started a movement that changed the world. Among them was Peter, right, who became, as we know now, the rock on which Christ started the church. And Peter was a fisherman. He was not somebody who was particularly influential or effective, but he became, some might now use the language, the first pope, or he became pivotal to the early growth of the church. He led the church in Jerusalem after Jesus' death, and just an absolutely massively effective person. And then finally, of course, Jesus himself, right? Jesus is in some ways like all of us, including the least of us, in that he did not have the characteristics of royalty. He was not born into that. And I know there are verses in Isaiah that describe Jesus as not even being possibly the Messiah being the most handsome person, or was not easy on the eyes or something. Jesus was not, what makes Jesus distinctive and godly is perhaps not certain worldly attributes that we associate with effective people today. Although Jesus was, in my view, the most effective person ever. There are many scripture verses that talk about God using the ordinary to fulfill his purposes, right? We read in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, not many of you were wise by human standards, not many were influential, not many were of noble birth, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so no one can boast before him. Here we see a key theological reason why God uses the weak to shame the strong. It's so that God can show his strength and show his glory. That reminds me of just Israel in general, right? Where God chooses Israel, not because, it says in scripture in some places, not because Israel was great or mighty or many in number, but precisely because Israel was weak. God would use Israel to show God's strength. We read again in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, where he felt God saying to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in weakness." And so because of this, he can rejoice in his weaknesses. And finally, I just remember this command in Matthew 20, where Jesus says the great reversal, right? The last shall be first, and the first last, for many are called, but few are chosen. And what does this all mean then? Is there a contradiction between the effective altruism focus on exceptional talent and the biblical tendency to use ordinary people? Maybe when we discuss this, it would be helpful to think of what is this EA focus on exceptional talent? Maybe you don't think there is really a focus on exceptional talent. It just happens to be that exceptionally talented people are interested in EA. I think it's probably a bit stronger than that. If you look at least 80,000 hours and the kinds of people that 80,000 hours are trying to mentor, they do focus on high impact potential people. And they do want to put these exceptionally talented people in exceptionally important positions. And they would argue that it's just unwise to do otherwise, right? So is there any tension here between the biblical tendency, and how should we as Christians think about, also just think about ourselves and think about ordinary people and how God fits in to this community where there is some emphasis on exceptional talent?